you for inviting me, and thank you for allowing me to be here today to talk with you about climate change and mental health. And I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of what we know about the impacts of climate change on mental health. I'm sure that everybody here recognizes that climate change threatens human well-being. It's not just about polar bears and icebergs. It's about our homes, our livelihoods, our physical fitness, our exposure to disease, our emotions, our mental health, and our overall well-being. And we have more and more evidence to demonstrate the ways in which this is true. I particularly want to highlight the place of mental health. And this is true for several reasons. One is that mental health is generally under-recognized as something that's going to be affected by climate change, and in fact is already being affected by climate change, as I'll say. The second reason is that mental health is a fundamental part of overall health, and that's not always recognized. So people, I think, give greater priority often to physical health without recognizing that it's just impossible to fully distinguish physical health from mental health. Imagine if you have insomnia or substance abuse, or you're so stressed out that your immune system is affected. The mental and physical aspects really play into each other. And of course, they also affect and are affected by community health. So people who are less healthy are less able to contribute to a functioning and resilient community, and people who are experiencing community stressors are more likely to have physical and mental health impacted. So mental health is really something we need to be paying more attention to. And finally, mental health is important to consider because although some of the impacts of climate change are, while very important and significant, might be limited to those who experience a certain kind of effect, those who are in areas that are prone to wildfire, or those who are losing their homes to sea level rise, for example. Mental health can be impacted by anybody, whether or not they're experiencing direct impacts of climate change. So there's really the potential for mental health impacts on a very, very broad range of people. And finally, I just want to highlight this diagram on the screen. In addition to showing the ways in which physical, mental, and community health are all interconnected, shows you how they're all affected by the impacts, the geophysical impacts associated with climate change. But those impacts are mediated by vulnerabilities. There's inequitable distribution of harms from climate change. And I'll say a little bit more about those in a few minutes. So the most obvious way in which climate change affects our mental health can be seen in the impact of extreme weather events. Living through a storm or a wildfire or a flood can be a traumatic event. It's terrifying. And after the event, there are many, many stressors to deal with. Your life is uprooted. You have to figure out things like where to live, where to get food, where to get medical help. You may have lost a number of things that are significant to you, including loss of life or health impacts on loved ones, but also cherished family heirlooms. So it's really a very, very disruptive impact. And along with that, we have decades of research on the mental health impacts of extreme weather events, showing that they are associated with increases in impaired mental health. Now, most people are resilient. It's not likely to be the case that most people will respond to an extreme weather event by developing a mental disorder, but very significant increases in rates of mental illness, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, even things like substance abuse, sleep disorders, and thinking about suicide. So that's something that is already increasing due to the increases in extreme weather that are part of climate change, and it's projected to continue to increase. Less obvious to many people are the chronic changes that are a part of climate change. So the acute events, they're terrible, they're stressful, they're traumatic, but they are time limited, and the storm passes, the wildfire's over, and you start thinking about how to get back to your life. These chronic changes, gradual increases in temperature, changing patterns of precipitation, sea level rise, things like that. There is no point at which we say, okay, that's done, now let's adjust. It's a continued process of adaptation and adjustment. And we don't really know how some of those things are going to affect us. But there is, again, quite a substantial body of research showing that heat in particular has an impact on mental health. Heat is associated with increased interpersonal aggression, which is, of course, going to be a threat to mental health. That's true on both the interpersonal level and also the intergroup level. Heat is also associated with increases in psychiatric hospitalizations and suicide rates. So we already see the impact of these heat events, and everything else being equal, can anticipate that that will become more substantial as time goes on. And other things that are associated with climate change include involuntary displacement if you lose your home, or impacts on food security, which is projected to decrease, so more food insecurity due to climate change. Those things also, in addition to being difficult in all kinds of ways, have an impact on mental health. So we can really anticipate these potential increases in impacts on mental health. Now, another thing that we're only beginning to kind of recognize the extent of is simply worry about climate change. As I said a minute ago, you don't have to be directly impacted to have your mental health affected. And we know that many people around the world are expressing high levels of concern and worry about climate change, and not just climate change in general, but about the potential that they themselves will be harmed by climate change. And we refer to this as climate anxiety. And although climate anxiety itself is a perfectly rational response to the problem, it's another source of stress and can be essentially the straw that breaks the camel's back in some ways. It can push people into a state where they are experiencing decreased mental health. And we know that climate anxiety is associated with increases in anxiety and depression. So this too is going to be something that we expect to see increases. I also want to emphasize, as I said earlier, the inequities that will be associated with the impacts of climate change and are already associated. So there are a variety of things that can increase vulnerability to climate change. As probably many people are aware, certainly there's going to be geographic disparities. Some people just happen to live in more vulnerable areas, areas that are prone to coastal erosion or to drought or to wildfire. But it's also the case that lack of economic resources can make you more vulnerable, because money can help you protect yourself from the impacts of climate change, although it can't completely eliminate those threats. Money can also help people to recover from the impacts of climate change. So people who are less well off are at greater risk. It's also the case that there are both within and across countries disparities in that are associated with ethnicity or other demographic characteristics. So for example, within the US, we know that a history of discrimination in housing policies has led in many cases to African American populations being located in areas that are more vulnerable to things like flooding and to higher temperature levels. There is a clear link between the average temperature associated with these less desirable neighborhoods, so they're more exposed to higher temperatures and the impacts that I already mentioned. And so socio kind of discriminatory vulnerability to these mental health impacts is an important part of the picture. And I also finally want to highlight the impact on children, because of course, children are the future. We have a responsibility to look out for our children. And there's evidence that they are more seriously impacted in terms of mental health by extreme weather events. They're certainly more vulnerable to impacts of things like inadequate nutrition or temperature. And when children are affected at an early age, these impacts on their mental, not just their mental health, but actually their cognitive capabilities, their ability to regulate their own emotions, those could be long-term or even in some cases permanent effects. So all of this is to say, again, in this very brief presentation, we really need to consider the mental health impacts of climate change. We know, we have very good evidence to show that climate change is affecting and will affect mental health through multiple channels, including climate anxiety affecting people who are not directly experiencing the effects. And responding to this mental health crisis requires us all to promote resilience, both at an individual level through individual mental health outreach and therapies, but also at the community level. There's a way for every one of us to contribute to promoting resilience in the face of climate change. And we can do that better when we're informed about the possible impacts.
Hi, my name is Gavin Ray, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral candidate in the University of Kentucky in the Epidemiology and Biostatistics program. And today we're going to talk a little bit about children's mental health and post-disasters, and a little bit about how climate change is related to these things. From 1980 to 2020, the cumulative cost of disasters is about $1.75 trillion. And of course, because of climate change, we are seeing an increase in the frequency and severity of storms. Today, we're still dealing with COVID-19. And similarly, we are also seeing an increase in the number and severity of pandemics. From 2005 to 2019, those same storms cost $1.15 trillion. That's 65% of the cost of natural disasters in 15 years from a 40-year period. It means that the danger of natural disasters and its impact on our society is going to continue to rise. And so one thing that public health and epidemiologists and those of us who are involved in community work need to do is to better prepare our communities to deal with the impact of these storms. In disaster work, the thing that we like to say is that disasters themselves may be national events, but their actual experience is local. We understand that because disadvantaged communities have historically suffered due to socioeconomic inequalities and inequities due to a variety of reasons, such as legislative oppression and structural systems of discrimination. These groups are often racial minorities, women, and the economically depressed. In fact, women and children are often the ones who experience the greatest impact of storm and other community perturbances. These communities that experience these disasters have lasting disparities in mental health outcomes, economic impact. We understand that biological differences do not drive these inequities, but rather these larger social systems. Now, my current work and my current project focuses on Hurricane Harvey. And so Hurricane Harvey was a Category 4 disaster that struck Texas in 2017 in August. It impacted about 13 million people and 3 million children, 60% of which were from low-income families. As an example, 650 children, 650 childcare programs were destroyed. Many children missed school for extended periods of time. In 2020, reports suggested that a large percentage of people perceived the impact of the storm to be over. However, further surveys found that 20% of those affected were still reporting to be living in a period of displaced housing or temporary housing. How can that be? And how do we understand that? One way to understand how there can be such a disparity in the impact of storms and the impact of disasters is the disaster vulnerability model. One such model is this hazards of place model of vulnerability. These are various pieces that go into what makes a zone vulnerable or more likely to experience the impact of disasters. And so we know these things are like resource access, political representation in places of power and decision-making, social capital, income, build, stock, and age, the welfare and health well-being of the community members already. Moving from that, we see that currently there's an estimated 20% of Americans who are experiencing some sort of mental health condition, with the industry experiencing about a $200 billion industry. Now, it's important to know that these estimates are underwhelming and underrepresented. Access to mental health care in America is very limited. Restrictive coverage policies, costs, stigma, cultural obstacles that make mental health access difficult. Now, research currently suggests that about 25%, there's a 25% increase in depression diagnoses after a disaster. There are clear relationships between a disaster and acute rise in depression. And this, of course, makes sense because of the increased economic concerns, loss of your home, and loss of well-being, including loss of life of your family members. Now, there's a clear relationship between children's mental health and their parents' mental health, meaning if we were to examine and understand what is going on with our children, we can also understand what's going on with our community at large. Mental wellness as a concept, however, in the US is focused on Western idealized portion of well-adaptive social behaviors. Now, how do we understand that? What does that mean? When we are looking at a mental health diagnosis, what we are looking for are things like maladaptive behaviors that are abnormal or don't necessarily fit in with our social norms. The problem with this sort of definition is that it can be limiting to non-mainstream cultural identities and to other marginalized groups that have very different understandings and ways of interacting with each other. This means that in order to understand what is going on, we have to have some sort of bias protection. We have to understand the individual needs, the community-specific needs of those that we are trying to understand and serve. That means with regards to social engagement, we need to keep those things in mind so that we can understand and make sure that we are incorporating cultural awareness into our preparation and our plans. Now, children's mental health, as we've already discussed, serves as a strong proxy for community health because it's a reflection of the resources and disparities that already exist in those communities for their parents, for their schools, for those in those spaces that they move. Now, health outcome data is plagued by various obstacles, but the most important of which that I have discovered in a lot of my research is about access to care. Even research that's trying to identify certain health outcomes, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and things like that are always going to be limited by understanding and by interaction with children. So if those children don't have access to care, then the understanding of what is going on in our communities is going to be very limited. But as I said, by focusing on children's well-being and taking into poverty, we can ensure that future growth after these disasters, how we recover, is going to be stronger and more inclusive. Now, what can we do about these things? One of the most beneficial things that we understand are these school-based mental health programs. These are things like individual therapy, group therapy, school counselors. But in order to prepare for that, we need to ensure that parents have support, staff has support, and including the therapists themselves. Specific disaster and trauma-related training is something that a lot of therapists continue to report as something that they don't have, or the specific resources they need are not available. So it becomes incumbent upon us not only to consider what is going on with our children, to develop programs, both psychological and psychiatric in nature, but also socially based programs that encourage interaction with their communities, that are about revitalizing the spaces that those children have to inhabit. But we also need to ensure that we're actually supporting the adults as well. This is the sort of thing that's necessary as we begin to plan and consider the change and the needs of our children. We see this as something that's incredibly important right now for COVID. There's a significant increase in rise in depression among high school students. How we respond to that, how we prepare for that is something that's so important moving forward, and it's something that we need to consider. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for trying to understand and trying to prepare how we think about mental health, how we think about children's mental health, it's not just about children, it's also about how we prepare our communities. Thank you so much. Now, moving forward, the next person up is Dr. Christie Manning, and she's going to be talking about the psychological barriers to preparing for climate change.
Thank you, Gavin, for your work on children's mental health. And hello, everybody. My name is Christie Manning, and I'm coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota, Macalester College. I'm going to tell you a little bit about psychological research on the barriers and how to overcome them to climate action. We know from polling data that most Americans are concerned about climate change, yet that concern has not yet translated into the kind of individual or collective action that we need to really address the issue. So I'm going to talk about some of the barriers and then at the end switch over to how we overcome them. The first barrier is the fact that many proposed climate solutions, like a carbon tax or the Green New Deal policy proposal, conflict with political worldviews and ideologies that prioritize limited government and limited government spending. This explains in part why a conservative political identity tends to be a predictor of climate skepticism. All right. The second barrier affects people of all political identities, and that is the sense that climate change is something still kind of off in the distance, both in time, in space. It's something that we still have time to address. We can take care of more urgent and important things first. It's kind of like the rain in the background of this image. We see it and we are worried about it, but we're not immediately taking cover because it's still kind of far out there. The third barrier is called pluralistic ignorance. And this stops us from engaging in climate action because we see social cues from other people that we don't interpret as them thinking that we're in a climate emergency. People don't feel necessarily comfortable talking about climate change, nor are a lot of people publicly displaying the fact that they are taking deep climate action, like stopping taking airplane flights and other things that are very significant. And so because we don't see that in other people, we tend to then interpret that as, oh, well, maybe climate change isn't that big a worry after all. This is false. This perception that other people aren't worried about climate change or taking action. In fact, many people, as I mentioned before, are very worried about it. But we are afraid to bring it up or to talk about our own worries or actions on behalf of climate change because we don't see other people talking about it. So that means we think we might be rejected for bringing it up. We need to dispel this pluralistic ignorance, and we need to start talking about climate change more and also putting out there the things that we're doing to address the crisis. And finally, the fourth barrier is that we all need, before taking action, we all need a sense that I can do this. I know what to do, I know how to do it, and I can personally be successful in taking action. And we also need to feel like our actions are going to have the desired outcome. That's why I have the picture of a light bulb here, because we know that changing a light bulb, well, I'm sure I can do it. That's pretty easy. I know that my changing one light bulb isn't going to be enough to address this crisis. So we need to offer people opportunities to do things that they feel like they can do and that they feel like are going to have make a dent in the crisis. All right, now I've talked about the bad news. I'm going to turn my attention to the good things, what we can do about it. There are solutions. These barriers can be overcome. The first way to overcome the psychological barriers to engagement and action is to help people establish a personal connection to the climate crisis. This overcomes psychological distance. When you feel like it's about you, you are more likely to want to take action. And in fact, people are gaining more of a personal connection. With every heat wave that happens, with every extreme storm, people are making the link. What happened to me was climate change. Fortunately, we don't all need to experience a significant event like that. We can also establish a personal connection to climate change through storytelling, through understanding that my time in the garden and the things I'm observing in my own backyard, while maybe not an extreme event, I see the signs of climate change there. And understanding that through storytelling workshops or through reading other people's stories and realizations about climate change really does bring people closer to the issue of climate change. And I'm featuring here a wonderful colleague of mine in Minnesota, Josna Harris, and she runs many storytelling workshops where she helps people understand their personal connection to climate change. And the research shows that not only the power of telling your own story, but listening to other people's stories has a real impact and lowers psychological distance. The second bridge to engagement and action is seeing people take leadership and take action. It can be a person of power and influence. And this image is of Bob Inglis, who is a Republican former senator from South Carolina. He has founded an initiative to help promote engagement on solutions to climate change that align with conservative values. So he's an example of a perfect person who can also help overcome the barrier of belief systems, because he's helping people see that you can hold conservative, limited government belief systems and still be in favor of taking action on climate change. You don't need to be a well-known famous person. People in our everyday lives also can demonstrate visible leadership and bring other people on board to taking action on climate change. This is an image of another group of Minnesotans, health professionals, who are demonstrating for action on climate change. And in fact, health professionals are really well positioned to help people make the connection between their own personal health, their family health, and the climate crisis. But I want to say that each of us can also do this. We can each be a visible leader and take action on climate change, because the more you see it in your everyday life, from people you know, people you run into in your neighborhood or at the grocery store or at work, the more you feel drawn to also take climate action, turn your concern into action yourself. And then finally, an important bridge to climate engagement and action is to find opportunities. We need to create opportunities for everybody to get involved in meaningful action. This is an image of a solar garden on a rooftop in Minneapolis. This is a cooperative solar garden. There are very low barriers to participation. You can be a renter and participate and own a share in this solar garden. There are no income requirements. You just need to be a electric utility payer. So this is an example of ways that we can open up climate action to a wide variety of people, and people will and do respond. And then a really important note is that activism, creating opportunities for activism, is also a great way to get people involved. Activism puts pressure on those with decision-making power, with political power, to move us along, to create policies and change the systems, change the infrastructure in which we live to address climate change at a systems level. But in addition, there are really great individual benefits to taking part in climate change activism. Recent research shows that people who participate in activism have a mental health buffer against climate anxiety. So there are multiple benefits to creating opportunities for people to participate in activism. So that's the perfect note on which to pass this over to my colleague, Dr. Derek Sabari, who will be speaking about building mental health resilience through climate solutions. Thanks everyone for listening today, and I'll turn it over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Christie. My name is Dr. Derek Sabari Jr., and I'm a clinical psychologist working within the fields of climate and eco-psychology with an emphasis on social and environmental justice. With this short moment of time, I want to bring to you a story of mental health resilience for the purpose of hoping everyone reflects on this and sees themselves in it, because we need everyone for this work. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has released their guidelines for building climate resilience. The first thing that they start with saying is our outlooks and perspectives have to be hyper-localized. What this means is we must learn to really tune into our surroundings and the ways that we will be impacted by climate in our local community. Right, so what are the ways we're going to see climate affecting our local rivers, our crop yields, our situations with flooding, for instance? And so I bring you a story of my experience as a Black American and American descendant of slavery, whose people are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And if anything, to think about how we can turn towards those around us to empower communities that are struggling and are struggling against environmental and systemic racism. So as a child, I remember growing up really in the streets of Detroit and really always seeing the ramifications of systemic racism. Right, and so the same streets that once roared with the innovations of my ancestors, but now we see them giving away to historical flooding. Right, thinking of these last several years within Detroit and Metro Detroit area, there's been flooding of freeways, flooding of city streets, right, overwhelming of storm drains. Right, and thinking, my people have always really had to struggle against the insurmountable, really for the fear of death. Right, whether you go back to the days of slavery, to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration, right, and then now looking at climate. And despite these existential threats, Black Americans continue to persist, spearheading environmental justice movements, and have been for decades. Right, and so what is this resilience? Right, if we're talking about mental health resilience through climate solutions, I think really also looking at those that are around us that are already showcasing these pieces. And I guess in that way, not to say that that is always a positive, right? In that sense that sometimes not everybody wants to always have to be resilient. And so it reminds me of the words of Fannie Lou Hamer. And so in one of her famous quotes, sometimes it seemed like to tell the truth today is to run the risk of being killed. But if I fall, I'll fall 5 feet, 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom. I'm not backing off. Man, to me, those are very powerful words to really understand that, we're talking about really this idea of tragic optimism. Knowing that necessarily maybe the situation doesn't change going forward, but I can at least be different in this space now, right? I can take my freedom in this space of how I respond to the crisis that's in front of me. And so this is really a reality, I think, with Black America, right? And often the steps we take carry our ancestors on our backs. And in that sense, the collective community is key. And if you're talking about making societal change, making not just societal, but ecological changes, we're talking about collective community. right? Which is difficult when we're also talking about managing our individual struggles and where do we fit into that? Right. So then I go back to Detroit and I think of Detroiters having stake in their city and communities, banding together, to create community collectives to address the impacts of racial disparity. Meanwhile, advocating for influencing legislature that allow environmental harms to be addressed instead of being erased from history. Right, and just thinking, we know there's many aspects of education that are not given within the traditional American educational system. Right, and so with this, the importance of community building, organizing, recognizing community needs are important steps as we're talking about building mental health resilience in communities and ourselves. Right, being able to say there's other people around me who are also a part of this, and maybe I can share some of these feelings in that sense with others. Right, I think of, existential psychologist, Irvin Yalom, who really believed in the idea that we all go through struggles and suffering within the human experience, right? And so how do we also have compassion amongst that for each other? Too long as Americans, there's often the catering to that individualism or incrementalism, right? In the sense of saying, okay, it's about somebody making just some small steps just to carry us forward. But the idea is it's not just about ourselves, it's also about our communities, right? Communities support and weather us through together. And the community is there to support when the individual can't do it on their own. Right. And so in this sense, I always say make your impact felt locally. Talk to other like-minded folks around you. Create community spaces for this. Find those community spaces that are out there. This crisis, nor any other societal level crisis, will be solved by the individual. Right. And we know there's a slew of humanitarian issues going on today. Right, and so how do we ask ourselves, how can we turn toward those around us and engage them? Right, instead of engaging the news, or engaging these kind of aspects of really the doom, right? Social media, doom scrolling, any of those things. But how do we turn around and say, okay, there's people in front of me who are feeling the same, who are thinking the same. So how do we support each other? How do we come together? Thank you for your time, everyone.